Hello. This pasture lease, including considerations for cornstalks and cover crops, is a breakout session at a recent UW Extension land rent webinar discussion. My name is Bill Halfman. I'm the Agriculture Extension Agent in Monroe County.
And I'm Carolyn Ihde, the Extension Educator for Crawford and Richland counties.
We're going to cover some different topics that should be taken into consideration with pasture renting.
There are many considerations to take in mind when you're creating a contract between the renter and the landowner. The first of most consideration is the start and stop dates. So when will grazing start and when will grazing end? And that's really based upon the weather and the growth rate of the plants. So we want to make sure we have good growth on the grasses and forbs before we start grazing. And then we have to keep an eye on that throughout the grazing season. Maybe we're having drought problems, maybe it's being extremely wet. We don't want to damage those plants because they're perennial plants, and that's what we'll be using continually. And then how does this impact the rental rate? Depending, are we getting in there earlier or late? Some other things we want to consider are specific property allowed to be grazed. Are there woods connected to the pastures? Are the animals going to be allowed to be in the trees in those parts of the pastures? So just keep that in mind also. Bill?
Carolyn, when you're talking about start and stop dates, would that also maybe be something to consideration in the discussion on whether the landowner wants the renter overwintering the animals at that site or not? Should that be something else they should discuss?
It's extremely important to discuss. So maybe a cattle owner has in mind, well, I'm going to keep them out through the winter, but the landowner had no idea that that would be part of something that the cattle owner would want. So extremely careful to make sure that all those dates are in writing before the cattle hit the ground.
Okay. As we move along our list here, the other another topic that needs to be considered, and of course this is one of the big ones, is how is the rental rate determined? And it could be on a per acre for the year basis, or it could be on a per head or per animal unit type per month basis for the time that the animals are there. And both options are reasonable. Sometimes we encourage folks to look at the per head per month, and we have to keep in mind that all pastures are not created equal. And so the productivity of the pasture and some of those factors should be considered when you were looking at it on a per acre basis. If the per head per month method is utilized, sometimes that can help take into account automatically some of that productivity difference, and perhaps also help prevent the possibility of overstocking the pastures. Another important factor is, when is that payment due? And sometimes maybe there's some sort of a down payment put in place, and then the balance is due at the end of the season once they know how many head were there for whatever length of time. Sometimes it's paid on a monthly basis. It's really up to the landlord and the tenant to decide how they want to handle that situation. Another topic that is important is fence responsibilities, and that can vary a lot too. There's no standardized protocol for who is responsible for the fence. Sometimes the way it's set up is that the landowner will make sure that the fences are in good repair at the beginning of the grazing season, and then it's responsibility of the tenant to keep them that way. Sometimes the tenant will be responsible for the fences all season long, and by doing that, then maybe they would have a lower rental rate. And then sometimes it can be split where the landlord would pay for the materials and the tenant might provide the labor to get them fixed. So there's a number of ways to do it, but it certainly should be addressed when the agreement is being discussed and put together, and who's responsible for the fence.
Very good. So another key important aspect to think about is the water source. Are those cows going to have access to water, and are they going to be there in the winter during dry spells? And so there needs to be ideas of how those cattle or sheep, goats, horses, whatever, are going to be having access to fresh, clean water. We have to be concerned about some of those NRCS improvement creek access plans. Are they going to have access through the whole creek or just certain places? Is the water access going to be through a pond? Or are there tanks that need to be filled by a well, and who's responsible for that? That could be negotiated between the tenant and the landlord, but somebody has to know how those are getting water to make sure that's covered, because water is very important. And then also, if it is being filled from a pump through a well, is there going to be extra electricity costs to cover that? So that's something to take in consideration. Another thing to think about are dry lots or housing facilities. Are those available on the land? They may be available on the land, but are they going to be part of the contract? Are those animals going to have access to dry lots or housing facilities? And how will that come into play with the rental rate? Another thing that's important is handling facilities. Are there places to catch those animals for load out and delivery? Feed bunks. Are there feed bunks available, and are they to be used only during certain times of the year? So we keep getting into this, but there are lots of things to talk about, right, Bill?
That's correct. And a lot of that is, a lot of these rental agreements maybe are beyond more than just the simple renting in the pasture in the summer, or maybe they aren't. And it's each situation needs its own set of discussions. As silly as it sounds, it's also important to state the specific purpose of the contract, what is and what is not part of the contract. More than once we've gotten calls where somebody has rented a certain piece of property either for crop production or for renting of the pasture, and the communication is not done well, and the tenant believes that they are entitled to have hunting privileges on the land as well, or snowmobile privileges, or different things like that, horseback riding for recreational purposes. And that is not what the landlord thought that they were agreeing to. And so it's important to state that what the specific purpose of the rental contract is. Along the same lines, it is important that they state what is and what is not allowed. Sometimes we get calls because a renter cut down some trees, or a renter subleased out some land or a pasture to somebody else, or different things like that. Or in some cases, maybe the renter thought they were the only one renting the pasture, and the landlord rented out some of the pasture to different people as well. So all of these things need to be discussed, and they need to be addressed as far as what both parties agree to up front, as regards to the specific purpose of the contract and what is not allowed to be done by the renter and the landlord during the time that the lease is in effect.
And does the landlord contribute any labor or management? Sometimes the cattle owner may live quite a distance away, and the landlord is able to keep an eye on those animals. Maybe they offer the mineral, free choice mineral. Maybe they're doing some supplementing feeding, or maybe they're managing the breeding season. Those are some things that you can ask the landlord if they're willing to do, if they want to do, or if they want to be totally hands off. It's something that could increase the rental rate, but it also can play on your peace of mind that somebody is actually looking at your animals on a daily or a weekly basis, probably daily, but just so you know that you have somebody with boots on the ground, especially if you live quite a distance away from the land and where your cattle are. One of the biggest considerations should be insurance. Whose insurance is going to cover anything that may happen to the cattle? If they're fencing, get through the fence and they get on the highway, there's going to be some insurance involved, and both parties should have insurance, and that should be discussed prior to the rental rate or to the rental contract being made. And Bill, would you like to enter any other information into this?
Well, as far as the liability insurance goes, I think it's a good idea for both parties to discuss it, but also for both parties to discuss it with their insurance agents to find out, is it possible that one policy may be sufficient for both, where they could both be covered under a policy, or do each party need their own policy? It's something that's important to discuss and know, to make sure that everybody's covered in the event that something unexpected happens. The other last two topics that we've got here, which are also important, is right of entry. And if we look at, this is more for the landlords to make sure that they have on there. If we look at some of the rental rules in the state of Wisconsin, once the rental contract is in place, if it is not stated specifically in the rental agreement, then the landlord does not necessarily have the right to enter the property whenever they see fit. So it's important that the landlords probably want to include in their rental agreement that they reserve the right to enter their property at any time that they see fit, as long as it's not interfering with normal ag production practices that the renter would have there. So that you may want to go out and check things, make sure everything's okay, or heard there was a problem in another part of the property that's not part of the pasture rental agreement, but in order to get there, you may have to go across or through there, and this would make sure that you have the right to do that. And then it's always a good idea to potentially have an early termination procedure in place. What if we have a situation where they have a severe drought or some other situation where for some reason the pasture is not suitable for producing crops? Do you want to be able to just have the animals taken somewhere else, or are you okay with them staying there as long as sufficient supplemental feed is provided? And there's some risk of possibly damaging some of the fields if they're left there, but maybe they're spread out enough that it's not. But always having some kind of an early termination procedure in place is a good idea. In most cases, we have these in there, but we hope we never have to use them. So that's kind of an overview of some general pasture lease considerations. We'll move into the next section and talk maybe a little bit about some of the specific needs and considerations for grazing corn stalks, renting out fields with corn stalks for cattle to graze them.
So corn stalks are a great way to extend the grazing season into the fall and maybe early winter seasons. But as before, we need a stop and start date. When is that start date going to happen? And when are the stop dates? So stop dates may be determined on the weather, and it may also be determined on about the amount of corn stalks or fodder that has been removed from the fields, because we know that we want to increase organic matter in our fields, and leaving the corn stalks out there is a good way to do that. Plus, when the animals are moving about, they're incorporating the dry matter, and they're also doing some fertilization. But we have to be careful about our muddy fields, excessive muddy fields, because they could be doing some damage to that soil structure and texture that we need to have in place to grow great crops. Snowstorms, if our cattle are stuck out there in a snowstorm, are they going to be able to get to fresh water and hay, and then have some backup plans if we're not able to remove those animals, or if there's a heavy snowfall and they're not able to access enough corn stalks? And that leads us into the next part.
Right. And so in addition to the information that Caroline talked about as being important to have a plan in place, supplemental feeding, is that going to be allowed? Certain categories of animals may actually benefit greatly from some supplemental feeding when they're out on corn stalks. But if the supplemental feed is always placed in the same place, then we'll get some muddy, worked up areas and possible soil compaction and some other problems there. Along the same lines of supplemental feeding is, as we talked about in the previous slide, where is the water source for these cattle that are out on corn stalks? Is that something that's going to have to be, some water tanks on wagons with some drinking cups, or is there a pond or stream nearby that can have fence to the access, or something like that? Those things need to be taken into consideration, and which party is responsible for providing that. Along those lines, then, in order for the field to be kept in good conservation compliance, there should be a discussion up front about how much residue do they want to see grazed off, and more importantly, how much residue do they want to have left on there to help keep the soil in the field, and to have a good cover for erosion control and some of those kinds of things. Those should be discussed up front so that both parties are on the same page, and that then also helps determine roughly the number of days that the cattle will be out there grazing.
And that leads us into the next part, pricing per acre or per animal. And that's easy to do when you know how much residue you want to be left there, so that you know the length of the grazing time. So that's something that needs to be discussed. And as before, when are those payments due? At the beginning of the grazing or after? Another consideration that we might not think about much is the pesticide restrictions from the previous crop. Has there been an insecticide, a fungicide, or an herbicide applied to the crop? And what is the labeled use of that? Is it labeled to be used as grazing? Is it restricted for grazing or fodder removal, or even making corn stalk bales or stacks? So that's something we need to really study and have the information from the person who grew the corn the previous year. Was it the landowner or was that rented out? So that's something that really needs to be taken in consideration and have all the information before those cattle or sheep or goats or horses. I saw horses grazing on corn stalks once. So we have to know all that to keep our animals safe and to make sure that we're not having any residues in meat products.
That's right. And this question occasionally comes up, and it's one of those things, how come we put this in there? Because we've gotten calls about it occasionally before. Sometimes the landlord has been approached by somebody else that was not the renter that they had that actually grew the corn crop. And they might be approached, could they graze their cattle out there on those corn stalks for a while? And the question then becomes, who owns the corn stalks that are out there if it was grown by a different tenant than the one that wants to put the cattle out? And that needs to be a discussion between all the parties involved to figure out what everybody is agreeable with. Perhaps the renter that grew the corn crop was intending maybe to bale the stalks for their own operation. We don't know that. And that can create some unhappy situations between the tenants and the landlord. There is a nice tool. The University of Nebraska has a nice spreadsheet tool that does help folks look at costs, look at calculating some kind of a fair price to pay, a reasonable price to pay for renting corn stalks to be grazed by livestock out in the field after the corn is harvested. And the last thing we want to mention is, when we're looking at these different corn stalk fields, it's a good idea always to assess the fencing and make sure that whatever is there is sufficient enough, strong enough to be able to contain the animals. And as Caroline mentioned in an earlier discussion, if we've got contour strips with alfalfa fields in between cornfields, the alfalfa is going to be a strong attraction to those cattle to go into. So it may need a little bit stronger fence there, or in some cases, we've seen people put drift fences all the way across both and let them chew off some of the hay as well as the corn stalks as well. But usually we know how that goes there. It's kind of like going to the buffet. We go to the dessert section first and eat all that, and then we go find the rough stuff. So something to keep in mind and make sure there's adequate fencing. And if we don't want those hay fields grazed, to keep that stubble on there for catching snow, then we gotta take that into consideration as well. So our last topic that we'll discuss here is kind of some similar considerations that are kind of unique for possibly grazing some cover crops.
And as before, we're always starting with the start and stop dates because that's very important. But with cover crops, we have cover crops that are starting in the fall and grow into the spring, or some that are spring. So it's really important to know when that grazing will start, and that's based on the plant growth. We really have to be concerned also with our plants and keeping them safe. And then also in spring and fall, we could have really muddy situations, which could do damage not only to the plants, but to our fields. So there might need to be some backup plans in the fall in case it turns off cold and then our cover crops are not growing quite the way that we thought they would because of the weather has changed. So maybe that's something where you're going to have those early terminations. There's going to have to be a discussion. When are those cattle going to need to be removed, or is it going to be okay to offer that supplemental feeding, because that we know that supplemental feeding could save some of the land, but it can also cause those places where there's high compaction and damage. And then let's see. And we get the highest yield from our spring crops that are planted in the fall, but when are those going to need to be started to be growing? So a lot of things we need to think about is the crop rotation. Where does that fall in? And then, as before, who owns the cover crops, and are they going to be available to graze to maybe a second or third party? So just some things to think about.
That's correct. And I think it's important to reemphasize with cover crops, it's very important to have a backup. Whether it's going to be a big component on when they'll be ready to graze or when they won't be ready to graze, or when you need to stop. What's the crop rotation? How soon, if it's a fall planted cover crop, is the farmer going to want to plant the following crop after the cover crop? So that will dictate also when the animals need to be pulled off of there. And we can talk about, how much residue should be left. And again, this gets back into making sure we follow a good soil conservation plan, that we don't have it chewed down where there's very little residue to help hold the soil in place.
So that's the part, our main goal of our cover crops is to help our soil structures and keep our soils in place. But if we're overgrazing or damaging those plants, they can't do what they're put out there to be. Another thing, just like before, pesticide restrictions. I know that we do have a lot of different pesticides going in the crop before and the crop coming up. So we need to be aware of what all pesticides will be applied, and if they again are to be grazed or used for fodder. Supplemental feeding, again, we've talked about this a lot. Supplemental feeding can also be a good thing and can be a bad thing, double-edged sword. And then we also have to think about our water sources. Where are they going to have water? What's the path for them to get there? And make sure that we're keeping our conservation in mind.
That's right. And in some cases, we may have, situations where a potential tenant might approach landlord to say, hey, you're next door to me. And I'd really like to visit with you about maybe planting some cover crops that I could use for some supplemental grazing or supplemental feed for my livestock. And it could be cattle, it could be sheep or goats. All of them would benefit from that. So then it would, if that's the situation, then there can be part of the discussion would be which party would be paying for the seed or the seeding, or who would be doing it. And that gets then into all those discussions, the above things, some sort of a time frame for when it would potentially be available and things like that should be discussed in that, make sure that at the end of the day, when the dust settles, the agreement works out to be equitable as possible for both sides. And one use that we've seen and heard about some folks using cover crops for in the spring with some of the acres is they're actually using it as areas for the animals to calve or give birth, because it's an opportunity to provide a clean field that doesn't have a lot of manure patties and things like that already in it, sort of using a modified version of the Nebraska Sandhills calving protocol to get those calves off to a good start in a clean environment and get them up and running. And again, just like with corn stalks, grazing, and ultimately also regular pastures, fencing needs to be addressed, and making sure that in these fields there's certainly sufficient fencing, whether it's permanent or temporary, to be able to keep those animals in and where you want them to be without too much problems. So this is kind of a general overview of the number of the different criteria that should be taken into consideration when looking at lease agreements for permanent pasture, cornstalk grazing, and grazing of cover crops.
Thanks for joining us.